executive director for the Tahoe Resource Conservation District, which we have a 5-member board as well.
Wonderful.
We also have Julia Kim.
Oh, I'm not seeing. Sorry.
Hi. Yep, this is Julia. I'm on the line.
And what organization do you represent?
I'm with the Local Government Commission. We're a statewide nonprofit.
And are you on the board?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anybody else?
It looks like Renee may have just stepped away.
Yeah, clearly. Okay. I am going to go ahead and get started, and I'm learning how to use this tool. I tend to do this workshop series in real time. It's really nice to be in a room with other individuals who serve on boards. We started this series at the Community Foundation about 5 years ago, in part because we feel like our nonprofits in our community are only as strong as the boards who govern them. And that a good governance training will allow board members the opportunity to not only kind of access additional education around board governance, but to also have candid conversations with each other and ask questions at the community foundation level about board service and board challenges. Because serving on a board isn't always the easiest thing. It's really easy to get passionate about a nonprofit mission that you're serving and be able to roll up your sleeves and volunteer and be on the ground where you see that mission kind of come to life. But when you find yourself in a boardroom, sometimes you feel a little further removed from the mission, as well as, you know, a lot of the ways that boards have to work in order to be strong and be good fiduciaries, as well as kind of stay in compliance with their nonprofit status. These aren't things that naturally come to you in your work life typically. And so at the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, we've been really intentional about that good board governance is the secret to a strong nonprofit. Good board members can be trained. And so typically when we host this workshop series, we don't invite executive directors or staff members to attend these workshops for 2 reasons. One, we want the board members to take responsibility for their own volunteer. You can't delegate your board role to a paid professional. And so, you know, we really want the board members to show up. And 2, most of the stuff that is being taught in our series is something that most executive directors have been trying to teach their boards for a long time. And so most of the executive directors know this stuff, but in response to that, we will, for any of the nonprofits that take this governance, board members that take these workshops with us, we will give all the materials to the executive directors so that they have access to the same knowledge base that their board members were able to have by being involved with this series. So today what we're going to cover is the first of a 4-part series. And I'll get into that for a second, but I guess I just need to introduce Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. For those of you who don't know, we are a 21-year-old community foundation in the North Tahoe region on the California side. And we have been serving this community across a broad mission of what the community needs, from environmental protection to health and human service to arts and education. Whatever the issue is, we're focused on the whole community. There are community foundations all around the country. They're all unique to the place that they serve and the resources available to them. So the oldest community foundation is in Cleveland, Ohio at about 106 years old. And the largest one is in Silicon Valley at about $16 billion of assets under management. And we are 21 years old and 27 million in assets. And so that gives you a sense of scale. But our mission is really to connect people and opportunities to attract more resources for a caring, creative, effective community. what I like to say is we take good people with good ideas, find resources, and connect them so that good things happen in our community. And so, as I mentioned, this is the first of a 4-part workshop. And what's amazing about this series is we took what I think is the best of the best in board governance materials. We took the board source top 10 responsibilities of a board member, and we took independent sectors 32 guiding principles for good governance, and we blended the two into this 4-part workshop series. And so we begin with board responsibility and culture, which really begins with 4 areas that we're going to cover today: determining mission and purpose, building a competent board, electing an executive director, and supporting and evaluating the executive director. And just to give you the context of the top 10 responsibilities of a board member, as Board Source has kind of provided, the first 4 we're talking about today. The 5th and the 6th ones, the next 2 down, are in our second workshop around legal compliance and fiduciary responsibilities. And then we roll into the 3rd part of the workshop series around adequate resources and effective organizational planning, which is fundraising and strategic planning. And then the final piece, we separate the 2, fundraising, and then we go into strategic planning. We will be hosting the entire workshop series again this October. It will span the course of 4 Fridays in a row. And if you're interested in participating in that, we have limited seating available. You can take one or all of the courses if you're a board member, and you just need to email me. You might have some other fellow board members that you might want to divvy up the workshops with so that you can kind of divide and conquer. It's up to you, but we do have that available. But for today, let's focus on board culture and responsibility. And I think some of this stuff might come supernatural to those of you who are already serving on a board or have some history of serving on boards. And so we're going to really hit some of the highlights because I want to be able to leave time for questions that you have. And your questions can focus on today's workshop. But if those of you who have some burning questions of some of the other stuff, I'm happy to provide you with any insights I might be able to share. I think my position running a community foundation and my role in philanthropy and nonprofit service for 22 years gives me kind of a unique perspective on the nonprofit sector and good board roles and responsibilities. As a community foundation, not only do we see all of the nonprofits in our community and kind of what is present and alive for them as it relates to any operational challenges or even board challenges, but my own board I have to manage. And for 22 years, I've answered to at least 10 people in the role of governance. Every job interview I've ever had has involved at least, half a dozen to a dozen interviews to make sure that, all the board members sign off on me serving the mission that I'm trying to serve. And so I'm happy. I love being candid with boards. I love being able to say, this is what worked for us and what didn't work for us. And so it's just kind of a unique perspective as a grant maker over the years to kind of see what's worked and hasn't in communities. And then the last thing I just want to say before we dive in is typically I'm in a room with people and I'm making eye contact, and this is a little bit harder for me. So, again, I think there's a chat. If there's something that pops up, I'd love to hear from you. I hate one-way conversations, and I don't like to pretend that I'm the talking head leader. I think this needs to be a little bit more organic, but I don't know that I'll get that out of this webinar today. But I value that you're here and you're taking the time to do it. All right, so determining mission and purpose. So in order for a board to know how to work together and what they're working on, they actually need to know what the mission is of the organization. And different people have different opinions about what a good mission statement is. At the end of the day, it's something that all of you should be able to not only say out loud, but feel like you can get behind, and that all your activities and your resources are driving that mission. People get hung up on what's the difference between a mission versus a vision statement. And it's true that a mission statement needs to really spell out what you're going to do, who's involved, and how you're going to achieve it. Whereas a vision statement is where we want to be in the future. And so if you start with a vision statement, and not every organization has a vision statement. We don't have a vision statement because for us, community is kind of perpetually on our minds. A thriving, healthy community could be our vision statement. But in a vision statement, you're often trying to set a goal that is, it's attainable, but it's so visionary that it's going to take a while to get there. It's something that, inspires people to be involved in the work of your organization, whereas the mission statement really gets down to more of the tactical and strategic way that you're going to affect that vision, or you're going to affect that change. And sometimes right about now, people ask, is it appropriate to change your mission statement? Sometimes it's worth dusting off. I tend to cringe a little bit because anybody who's been involved in the wordsmithing exercise of something like this, some people really get into it. Others, are not so inclined. And so if you're going to go down that path, maybe be smart about the process itself. Kind of identify what the values and principles are that are bringing you together, why this mission is here. And then kind of lob it over to a smaller subcommittee to come back with, 2 or 3 statements that your bigger board can then kind of vote on or finesse if they need to. But at the end of the day, hopefully those who've crafted your mission statement have really been forward thinking and just very straightforward. There shouldn't be a lot of guesswork on what is it that they're trying to do. It should be something that your organization can grow into. And that kind of leads me into your bylaws, which is your operating manual. So your organization was chartered as a 501c3 by the IRS for a particular community benefit. And that is a unique role in the marketplace. It means we don't have to pay taxes because we make a promise to our community and our country that we're delivering a certain benefit. And when the IRS grants you that determination letter, it's for a specific thing you said. So when you think about dusting off your mission statement, what I would discourage you from is rethinking your charter as an organization. You still have to fulfill what it is that you said you were going to do when you were granted that 501c3 status. So I've definitely heard of organizations who've like, well, this isn't relevant, or, it's been years since it's been active, but let's just dust this off and repurpose it for this new mission. And I would just say, if you're in that kind of position where you're thinking that way, talk to somebody like myself or another nonprofit professional to guide you, because it's never really a good idea to just repurpose an organization that's already been in existence. And again, if you're thinking about freshening up your mission, you need to still stay true to what your charter is. The bylaws, however, are also a really important guide for board members of today and board members of the future to make sure that you're legally bound to a certain way of operating, and that, from one generation of the board to the next, there's kind of a handoff. Do the bylaws change from time to time? Yes, but usually under the oversight of an executive committee, and of which should probably have an attorney on board. And so this isn't something that you really want to be in a perpetual kind of change mode. But you do want to say, what is the size of the board? What are the roles and duties of the directors and officers? What are the procedures for board business? How do you vote? Can you vote? It used to say voting by mail, voting in person. How many days ahead do you need to post your documents for the board to review in order to vote? Those are all really good ground rules of engagement for everybody to approach the work professionally. And then if you have policies and procedures around grants or gift acceptance, things like that. So I'm going to stop there because I kind of go over that one a little bit quick, but are there any questions on just, you know, at the end of the day, those specific areas are about making sure that the board knows what it is they're there to serve. What is the purpose of the entity that they're serving? Does anyone have any questions or thoughts to share? Okay, great. Moving on. Building a competent board. You know, it's funny. I'm going to just stop there and talk about competency for a second. In the second workshop, we talk about legal and fiduciary compliance and ethical responsibility. And I'm just going to take a moment and talk about ethics for a second, because in ethics of a board that governs, I'm drawing from the second workshop because I think it's a good one to always bring to the table, is this duties of serving, and I said duties, D-U-T-Y in a plural. So it's duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. So duty of obedience is you were asked to serve on a board that has a certain mission. You have to be obedient to that mission, meaning you can't just say, I'm here to save the trees, and now I'm going to introduce a whole new programmatic strategy about saving the puppies. It doesn't mean that there's probably some connection between puppies and trees if you really try and stretch and there's the right funding, I don't know. But at the end of the day, you're there to obey to the mission that was granted at the federal level to provide that community benefit. So duty of obedience is to the entity and its mission. Duty of loyalty is that you are making decisions at the business level as a board member loyal to the organization's position and future. So you might wear a lot of hats in your world, and when you are wearing your board hat, you're being loyal to the best interests of that mission. And you're not thinking about, well, if I can help this mission over here, then it might help advance this agenda over there. And then the last one, which I'm really passionate about, is duty of care, which means you show up to make business decisions on behalf of that mission prepared. You've read the materials, you're willing to ask some of those questions that need to be asked, because, you know, I always like to think we're not going to change the world with like-minded people. It's unlike-minded people, when really bringing their best skills and their best questions to the table, that we can really negotiate solutions that are going to endure and be successful. And so duty of care means showing up prepared and ready to do the business of the organization. So that's just a little window into the ethics around good governance. So back to building a competent board. It starts with size. And so oftentimes you might have a passion. Oh, did somebody ask a question? I'm like almost begging. Okay, so the size is, you do need legally 3 to start, and that is a chair, a secretary, and a treasurer. And you really don't want to mingle these responsibilities, and you particularly don't want to mingle treasurer and board chair. You do not want the person who's at the top of the chain of command also managing all of the financials. It's just too much of a conflict of interest and could be a slippery slope. And so if you're in that situation and you need to be thinking about how to address that, again, I would go to a professional who can help you navigate that if you feel challenged in navigating it yourself as a single board member or a staff member. So distribution of duties is really important. And knowing the quorum size, size is going to dictate your quorum, and your quorum might be a majority or it might be 2/3, but that's going to be all dictated in those bylaws. Who's on the board? So diverse backgrounds and experience, very important. Sometimes people perceive that as challenging to have different personalities and different agendas at the table. I've even been on a grant making organization where we had grantees on our board. And what I learned how to do when serving that mission was to manage an active conflict of interest process where certain board members who had that conflict of interest were not participating in those parts of the discussion related to the mission. And so it just made me have to think about on an annual basis which conversations they could not be a participant at, and make sure that I built a calendar with an agenda, because they were all coming from different states. They were flying in. And so it was just really easy to say, you guys are going to miss the April meeting. But all to say, we should really challenge ourselves to have diversity in our boardrooms, even those people who might have a conflict of interest, as long as you're really handling that in a transparent and ethical way. But even the people who might really challenge your perspective in the mission, because it just makes us stronger when we learn how to navigate some of those difficult decisions and bring those inside our board who really challenge us. The majority should be independent. I say all of them should be independent, but at least the majority, meaning that they don't have a conflict, that they don't have some kind of benefit connected to them, and that they can separate and be there purely for the mission. Separation of duty, I think I've already shared that with you, and we'll get into the executive director's difference. But the one here that I just want everybody to hear is the separation of your board chair and treasurer's duty is kind of legally critical. Somebody might not have their mute on and we've got background noise, but if you have your mute off and you want to ask a question, I would love that. Board terms and expectations. So this is another area where organizations tend to kind of
I'm free. She has a much more unpredictable schedule. No, she's right here. She's doing something.
Hold on a second.
Trying to get
clear policy setting length of terms and number of terms a board member may serve. So this is an area where somebody needs to be paying attention. Typically it's the secretary at the board level. If it's not the secretary, sometimes it gets delegated to the executive director, but you really want to be in compliance with that. And part of that is you need fresh blood. You need a new generation always kind of coming into your board with a new set of eyes, asking the critical questions you may not have thought about. And so a lot of times when we see boards that haven't turned over, who don't have terms or are not keeping that good, cycle of people coming through, they tend to stagnate. They tend to continue to do things the same thing. It's the same gala we've always had, and so you really want to always you want to have a pipeline, and you want to be bringing in new board members. And the way to do that in a diplomatic way, if you will, is to really be true to the terms of service, and to make that an annual conversation with your board, so it never becomes awkward. Well, he's served on the board for 20 years and we just don't want to ask him to go because we love him so much. He's always been there for us. Like, you don't want it to become this emotional, personal thing. You just want it to be kind of transactional and business-like. If there's certain people who play a really significant role and you admire and value their historical knowledge of the organization, which is incredibly important, there's other ways to accomplish that than keeping them on the board. And really, some people call it hit by a bus. I always say move to Paris because I don't want to be hit by a bus. But, you always have to kind of look at all the institutional players within your mission and determine if that person moves to Paris, who's going to take that role. So those really valuable leaders need to be mentoring the next ones coming in line. And then procedures for removing board members unable to fulfill their duties. That's always a fun topic. Usually when I'm in a room full of board members, it gets kind of juicy because there's always a situation, maybe it doesn't happen that often, but if you go back historically into organizations, you see times where somebody's had to be kind of kindly offered another position in the organization, lead volunteer. Sometimes it's not that smooth. Sometimes it's some super candid conversations between board members. One of my rules as a CEO is that board members need to take the lead on board members' work. And so I can have some candid conversations about my board members' involvements in service and help them navigate. But at the end of the day, I'm not the one who's going to, quote unquote, fire a board member. A board member, the board chair, a past board chair, the founder, somebody's going to have to help that, because it's not the right position for a staff member to be left to kind of deal with that board work, because we're not speaking at the same level. There's usually a lot of engagement in that part of my presentation, but board orientation is really important. In fact, right? Yes.
Hi, this is Nicole. Renee Hamlin has posted a question on the chat. And it says,
I don't know how to see the chat.
Yeah, at the very bottom, if you click on it, it'll pop up a little pop-out box. But anyway, it says, have you seen a good transition of a valuable member to an advisory board?
Okay, I'm still trying to figure out how to see the chat, and I'm so delighted that she asked that question. Let me just...
It might be hard for you just because I'm guessing yours isn't full screen, but you might be able to minimize it a little bit and then also see the chat. And if not, I'm happy to read them to you as they come.
Okay, yeah, totally interrupt me because I love the questions. So,
okay, cool.
Transitioning a board member to an advisory. So that begs the question, are advisory boards valuable? And it becomes almost an evergreen conversation in most organizations because they realize that there's a role for people who have served and have tenure in an organization, but how do they, keep that close to them? I get really mixed messages on advisory boards, and I'd be curious if anybody here has had success with them. Advisory boards tend to be a good idea at the board level. They think it's great because there's another think tank that can help inform their thinking. From a staff level, it almost becomes another board that they have to manage, which sometimes can be problematic. I think that I have seen the use of at-large board members, board members like a founder who's able to kind of come and go and engage at times. I have seen, we manage a past board chairs committee, kind of. It's not a committee of the board, but they meet quarterly and they build the agenda. I don't have to bring anything prepared. We build the agenda at the top of the hour, and then the next 2 hours, I'm kind of answering their questions of like what they wanted to hear about. And it's fantastic because they actually help shape the discussion. When I go back to the board, I'm able, from those notes, I'm able to say, I talked this through with the past board chairs and they got super excited about this, or they had warnings on this, or they had this different idea, and it keeps them alive and active in the work. Advisory boards, I just don't have a ton of experience with them in real time. I've inherited, letterhead that has a list of advisors, and I'll say, so when do we bring them together? Well, we never bring them together. We just keep them on our letterhead. It's like, okay, I don't know if that's, so is there anybody else who's listening who's had success with an advisory board and has a stronger position for that concept?
This is Nicole. I guess my experience both as an executive director and on a board is that it's really hard to keep them engaged. And so once you lose the ongoing connectedness, I feel like it's hard to pull them back in. But we have had on Sierra Nevada Alliance board some success if you pull them in for a very, very specific project, or maybe a connection to an individual or an organization. That has been helpful.
Yes, that's my same experience. And we've also maintained committee roles for them. So their knowledge base in finance or, investments or whatever it is on committee, a lot of times we ask them to extend, and then project-based work. So, but it's a challenge. And, my board right now is flirting with the advisory board concept as well. And I will do what the wishes of my board are. My fear is that I'm now going to manage 2 different boards. And so it's a little bit of both. There's certain people, not just past board members, but there's certain people who you want closer to the mission that are just not quite board ready or, going to fit in the board culture. So we're trying to play with that model a little bit too. Does anyone else have anything to add on that front?
Stacy, this is Nicole again. I received a message from Marilyn Jasper, and she says every nonprofit she's involved with is having huge problems recruiting new board members. This is especially true when some level of expertise, such as law or government policy, is required or helpful. Any suggestions for recruitment?
Yeah. 2 things. Sector, community-wide, I am almost astonished at how little time people have these days. And I try not to take it personally. It is the nature of our society feels like it's going faster and faster. And the work of the board is slow and methodical and strategic and deep, right? And so getting all of us, who are juggling, the most successful people are the ones doing the most work. And so trying to get a successful person to focus on the next thing is challenging. But I do think for us, our cultivation is really, it's interesting. We almost treat those relationships that could be potential board members as something really precious. And we talk about it at the board, and we talk about the pipeline on a regular basis. And we test people in committees to see if they would be a good fit. And sometimes they're just great committee members. And so, really being intentional about that pipeline, that list of potential candidates. Often, and this isn't always true because sometimes it just has to happen, but, God help us if the first time we're meeting someone, we're asking them to serve on a board. There are a lot of nonprofits that operate that way, and you have to get in front of this work, and you have to make it a part of kind of your regular board meetings is, I just met this person, they could be a potential candidate. How do we start working them into the system? And we're all keeping an eye on them, not just the staff member or the one board member. And so, we're asking that person for coffee, so one of my board members says, I have somebody who I think might be a good fit. Suddenly, we're setting up a coffee just so I can meet them and tell them about the mission, not to ask them to be on the board, but just let's make sure that, when that time happens where we're asking them, they feel already kind of connected to it. And then the last piece is part of the reason we started this workshop series was not only to educate the existing board members, but to inspire new board members, because especially some of those individuals who are early on in their career, this might be intimidating work because they're just still trying to figure out their grounding in their own career. And so we figured as a community foundation, if we could start to train that next group, because, oh my gosh, I have so many opinions about this. Too often there's this whole philosophy of 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And I hate that, because I feel, when we accept that, it's almost from a privileged point. And I just wonder, of the 80% of the people who are not in the boardrooms, have we just not figured out the right pathway or inspired them to service? And so from a sector, industry standpoint, I think, organizations like mine need to really challenge ourselves to train that next generation and give them a clear path on how to get to it. And people serve for different reasons. It might, really speak to them as a mission, and it might just help their resume. And either way, we can still turn those into good board members. So anything else on that front? Thank you. Okay, so, when you have a new board member, it's so important to spend the time to orient them. And I'm about to have, I think, more than 3. If all of them accept, I'm going to have, I have 8 board members right now, and we're about to ask 5. And so it's going to be a little bit like romper room this next year because, and I told the board, you guys are seasoned, you know the business, we've got our calendar dialed, but it is time to start, bringing in more people. It definitely means a different type of year for me as the lead staff, because we're going to want to make sure that these guys are trained, and it takes a whole year. It takes a whole year of living through your job to know your job, right? Whether it's a paid position or a volunteer position. And so making sure you start out right with a good orientation. That orientation should be both delivered by a staff if you have it, and a lot of our nonprofits really don't. And so if you don't have the staff to do this work, it is the responsibility of the board. So they need to have the corporate documents. Everybody should have them. Everybody should have the bylaws, the articles of incorporation, and the IRS determination letter. You just need to have that available to you, and it should be read. You don't have to memorize it, but you should have read it. If there is staff, the board needs to know those functions. They need to have calendars ahead of time, ideally a year ahead of time. They need to know what the committees of the board are for, who the chairs are, how often they meet, and they need to be invited to find where they feel their service can be most valued and valuable in the organization. And so you might have brought them on because they're a CPA, so you're naturally going to try and slot them into the treasurer's position eventually. But I would encourage you to not throw them just into the thing that they know the most first, but walk them about the cabin, if you will, walk them around the mission, let them see the full spectrum of the work that you do. They're going to naturally gravitate to the work that makes the most sense for the skill set they bring, but you don't want to deny them the actual broader perspective of the work. They're going to be a stronger board member if they really see the whole picture. And so the orientation piece is really intentional. You can do it a lot of different ways. We give them a thumb drive of all sorts of documents. I even think I have the table of contents in the materials that go with this section, but be thoughtful about that and keep it fresh. And again, this would be your secretary's role. I'm always amazed at how the secretary, I'll say, well, what does your secretary do? Well, we've got staff to do the minutes. Well, there's so much more work than just the minutes. And people have forgotten the work of the secretary on the board. But this is the kind of stuff that, keeping up to date on the board terms, keeping orientation strategies fresh and available. There's work to be done even when you're a secretary. Board evaluation, you need to be evaluating yourself as a team, as a board. My board does it annually. They do it through a survey, some kind of feedback mechanism that can be anonymous is important, because sometimes when they're sitting in a big group at a board meeting, they're just not in that headspace, nor do they want to stick their neck out. And so you need some way, especially if you're at that board chair role, of knowing what are people really thinking. And also, creating a culture of open coaching, meaning if you guys are running late on your meetings all the time because the agenda is too packed, how do you coach that situation together? How do you agree that you're going to adopt the agenda in front of you, which means you're going to stick to a certain timing? How do you decide what the topics are so that you're not cramming them all into one meeting? So kind of always being open to tweaking the process so that you're running a smooth and efficient board, because unfortunately, when you don't do that, you will lose some of the most valuable volunteers because they have higher expectations for the way an organization is run. And so, one of the conversations I hear often for, especially around that board recruitment piece is, how do we really recruit the high achievers or the high net worth individuals who have, financial capacity? You really have to look at your business, and your business has to match the level of donor and the level of volunteer that you expect. So if you want professionals like attorneys and CPAs serving, you have to match the way you work with their expectations. you know, from time to time, you do need to dust off things and look at your governing documents, from committee charters to, you know, nomination processes, that kind of thing, just to make sure it's still serving you. And the way you know it's time often is when somebody joins the board and you're in the middle of an orientation and you're like, but that's not really how we do it. Well, if that's not how you really do it, then you need to bring your documentation up to date, because you made a shift for a reason. So just go ahead and like consciously think about that. But what you don't want to do is keep inheriting, you know, these governance documents and policies and procedures that continually are not being adhered to, so that, you know, 10 years from now, nobody really knows where they are. We never really valued it because we weren't doing it that way anyway. Like, that's some bad toxic culture, in my opinion, that can lead to just not good oversight and governance. So really having those right tools, from the board recruitment process to their expectations and feedback, job descriptions, volunteer job description, committee chair job descriptions, officer and director job descriptions. These are really important tools that I guarantee somebody on your board, and if not, recruit somebody who will geek out over this stuff and feel like they have made their contribution to the mission because they're one of those detail-oriented process people. So just make sure you've got the right tools in your toolkit for your board to be effective. Speak Your Piece is a campaign that the Community Foundation launched about 10 years ago when we were encountering some kind of toxic behavior in the community. And we adopted these 9 areas of agreement that the community said that this is the way we should go about business. And so I think like over 50 institutions in our community adopted these principles for the way they would conduct meetings. Small advisory meetings all the way up to jurisdictions, elected official meetings. It was a really popular campaign, and it continues to guide us today in the way that we ask our community, ask our board members, ask our staff members to behave when conducting business. And it's very simple, but it's surprising how when you go over it consciously and out loud as a group, it really sets the tone in a different way. So if you find yourself in a boardroom where maybe there's some tension and people are on different sides of an opinion because you guys are making a big decision for your mission, and a lot of emotions might tend to come up, or you know, kind of people on different sides of the spectrum, it's always a good idea to set the tone at the beginning. And I find that adopting these principles or some version that you guys all agree to and reminding everybody of those at the top of a meeting just completely changes the tone. I'm not going to read them to you because you can read them. So if you're lucky enough to have kind of outgrown your board for how to get the work done and you have found the funding to hire someone, it's really your first opportunity to delegate your board service. And so this is where I usually take a moment and I say, as a board member, you are 100% responsible for everything that happens in that organization. You take off your hat for somebody to run the bookkeeping and the finances, or for somebody to run the volunteer activity when you pay them. And that first person is your first chance to take that hat off. At the end of the day, though, whatever that person does is still your responsibility. And so we're going to get into, once you have an executive director, how you make sure that executive director is doing what they're supposed to so that you don't get in trouble. Because at the end of the day, if there's fraud or malfeasance of any kind, the IRS is going to the board, not to the top paid official, because you're in charge of that top paid official. It's so hard for a lot of my peers to hear that. A lot of executive directors like to be the leader, and I love being the leader. At the end of the day, though, I answer to a board of directors that is a volunteer board that is serving as governance and oversight to the mission. And so sometimes that is just not the way people were brought into the 501c3 world. Maybe a friend of theirs who runs the nonprofit asked them to serve as a board, and so they still have this friendship. And we know that the executive director is there every day, and she knows all this stuff. And so they don't really see themselves as oversight or governance of that person. But the reality is you are personally liable by even serving on that board to any of the decisions or the activities that take place under that. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but it's just so different when somebody hasn't had like an introduction to that reality. Succession planning is really important when you do have somebody in that role. And again, it's kind of the move to Paris scenario. So, knowing how things are going to roll if it's an emergency. And this is really, sometimes I'm giving this workshop to PT, like parent teacher organizations or booster clubs. You certainly have to right size your governance. So I don't expect volunteer organizations to have this level of depth, but it's good to know it. But succession planning becomes pretty important when it's an organization that, is mature and is managing a lot of assets and programs. So it's just something to be on your radar, and different ones of y'all listening, this might be really relevant, and others might be like, I'm just trying to figure out how to get our bylaws redone. So I get that. Support and evaluate your executive director. So again, your executive director is your pretty much only staff. Any staff members that come after that executive director are that executive director's staff. So if they then hire a development director and you set as the board a goal, if the goal doesn't get met, it's the executive director that answers to you, not the development director. And so that's where we start talking about those lines and distributions of duty. But knowing the difference between support and governance is kind of the first step. So, working boards versus governing boards, right? In a working board, it's all hands on deck. And you're going to find yourself as a board member being asked to do very staff level stuff like data entry or checking in volunteers or, whatever it is, you're kind of doing the work of the mission. You're not at the decision-making governance stuff. So you got to kind of know what hat you're wearing. And you're acting as an individual. So when you show up in that supporting role, you don't have your board member hat on. So you're not telling the executive director, here's how you need to do this better. You can suggest it. It's not like you can't, share your good ideas. That's absolutely important for an executive director to hear from any volunteer. But that executive director cannot take that as a direct, what is the word I'm looking for? A direct requirement of the board. So if you're at a volunteer luncheon and you're like, I really wanted shrimp and not chicken, that was you in your support role. You weren't talking on behalf of the board, we're going to serve shrimp. And you can't act independently from the board that way. You would have had to gone to the board and said, we're all about shrimp, not chicken. And the board would have been like, yes, let's pass a resolution. We're about shrimp. And then it gets delivered to the executive director, because otherwise the executive director is like answering to 10 other people who want shrimp or chicken. And it just the lines get blurry. I hope that made sense. Does that make sense a little bit? And then governance is when you're acting as a body. It's when the board actually says, this is what's important to us. And they deliver those expectations in annual goals and objectives to the executive director. And then that's what the executive director is going to be measured by in their performance review at the end of the year. So we talked a little bit about staff board boundary, board members managing other staff. So again, my board member can go and talk to our program officer, and they can work on committee work together. It's not like I'm going to stand in between them. But if the board member is going to one of my staff members and saying, I really want to change this policy on how we do this work, then it gets really dicey. The board members need to have strategy meetings with me and tactical meetings with staff. And if you've ever been in the staff role, you kind of have to learn how to juggle that a little bit. but it's really important for board members to be sensitive to it. And the longer you're in a board role, the more you're going to understand that. But it shouldn't be that no one's allowed to talk to each other, because that's also not a very healthy organization or environment. So don't manage other staff. And it's interesting, one little request, Joe, I was wondering, what does the donor database look like for everybody who wears purple in February? Do you think you could run that report for me? Joe's like, well, he's a board member. I'm absolutely going to run that report of everybody who wears purple in February. And then I come in and I'm like, what are you working on, Joe? Well, board member asked me to do this. How long have you been working on it? Well, it took 3 different, databases that I had to pull together. And then I had to take all the other colors out so that it was only focused on purple. I'm like, how many hours was that? Well, I'm about 12 hours deep into it. Okay, board member, if you need that report, you need to talk to me, because Joe actually has 8 other things on his plate that I'm measuring his performance on at the end of the year. So if your report made Joe decide not to do these 3 things, it's going to look poorly on his report. When you play that out, then the board member's like, oh my God, I didn't realize that I just completely rerouted your staff member. But sometimes it's just kind of this awareness and conversation. And then being aware of founder syndrome. So founders of organizations are powerful, and they are passionate, and they are the ones who birthed the organization and were able to convince not only the IRS that there was a community benefit, but probably hundreds and thousands of people to follow that lead and get involved and give money. And so they have a very kind of noble and established role in an organization, but it also can be a detriment to an organization. There's tons of articles out there. If you're in that place, if you're a founder, you might want to read those articles just to be aware that those conversations might be happening about you. And if you have a founder who's at the table, there's a lot of good tools out there on how to, again, start to open up that conversation and maybe transition the role a little bit. Okay, and this is in my part of my presentation where there's panelists, because usually the workshop is broken into 3 hours. Theory, which is what you just got. Practice, which is where I bring in people who are real live board members who have a good reputation and live it daily. And then theory or practice application. So the third part of our workshop is typically where we break out into groups and we start to apply the knowledge to some challenges that we'll give, but we're not doing that. So with that, I'm going to take a breath and I'm going to try and find the chat and see if I missed anything, but what questions do you guys have?
Stacy, this is Nicole again. Sorry, I've been the most vocal, but the evaluation that you were talking about as far as board members filling it out to kind of evaluate the structure and the style and communication likely of the board, is that a document that you would be willing to share for us to maybe glean from and work from?
I'm pretty sure it's actually in the materials that I have for this, so yes.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and there, that's ours, and I'm pretty sure our board has probably tweaked it on an annual basis to ask certain questions, because what I would say is, have not a long exhaustive survey, but like maybe 10 questions, of which 5 or 6 of them are standard every year, so you can watch trend lines. And then I would ask the board before sending it, what are some of the other questions we should be asking each other, so that you can kind of make it relevant to that year. But yes, I think I've got some beginnings of that, and probably samples questions of ours, so for sure.
Great, thank you. I think
Welcome.
that's the one tool right now that, of course we could update our documents more regularly and all those things, but I think that's one piece that we can really incorporate.
One of the things I would suggest, we've found success, and it was just recently, we do an annual board retreat. That's, kind of a day of whatever strategy stuff we have to talk about. But we are now doing the survey before the retreat, so that the first part of our retreat is debriefing on the survey, and putting things out there like, gosh, we didn't realize that a handful of you felt this way, so let's talk about it. So coupling a survey like that with a retreat. The other thing is, some years we've opted to not do it only because the board hasn't changed, and everybody's clicking along. And so my board chair, in my 7 years, I've only seen this happen 1 year, but it felt very healthy. It was like, yeah, no, we've got enough work on our plate. We're all fully engaged. We're going to punt the survey to next year. So I think that's also an option, but it's kind of outside the norm. Our norm is to do it every year.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Hi, Stacy. This is Kelly from the Sugar Pine Foundation.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, good. I have a question for you on your thoughts on the frequency that the board should meet. You mentioned an annual retreat, so obviously a more concentrated time to work on some things. What about meetings and the communication of the board throughout the year?
Mm-hmm. You know, I wish there was like one answer, but I do think it takes a very conscious conversation. And I'll just give you a little bit of experience here. We met monthly for a long time, and the board here requires a lot of documentation and preparation for our board meetings. And so I kind of started to push back on the monthly meetings, just because of the amount of time and energy, and the committee work wasn't getting done that quickly. And so, you know, we have to send out the packets a week ahead of time for the board to review, which means we're in full packet production at mid-month, you know, 2 weeks after the last one and 2 weeks before the next one. And so on top of it, we're further along in our governance model, meaning we have more staff, professional staff to do the work. And so we still have a working board, but they're at strategic projects. They're not in the day-to-day running of the operations. And so I tried to push us. So from that monthly, like, oh my God, I feel like I was just hired to do documentation and packets. I was able to convince them to do quarterly, for 1 year, and they said no, because they felt disconnected to the mission and just didn't feel like things were like they really knew what was going on. So then I convinced them to do every other month, so 6 a year, and that worked better. But what we ended up landing on was what I call a waltz. We would do 1, 2, 3, skip, 1, 2, 3, skip. And, you know, so what you're hearing from me is this balance of what is the operational requirements to host a board meeting? How deep do they need to be in the operations versus strategic? And how many committees are you managing? Because again, I would leave my board meeting and then have 6 committees that I had to then go and do the same thing for in order to prep for the board. And some boards are kind of loose and they're like happy that they get minutes from the committees. My board is like, we have to have it all documented and approved, and you know, we treat every committee very formally as well. And so I just kind of pushed back a little bit, and we're getting, you know, and different years require different amounts of focus as well. And so, you know, some years when we've taken on a big project, we've had to adjust for that. The other thing, we've had our emergency board meetings when decisions have to get made at the board level. And I've learned they hate that, even though sometimes you just have to be responsive to the situation at hand. And so we're kind of in a constant dialogue and a constant tweaking and push and pull of what they need versus operationally what we can fulfill. The last thing I would add is this year was so interesting on my retreat. So we had nailed down like this amazing retreat. We were going to have these 2 speakers come in on topics that were really relevant and really forward thinking. And I had given them the pre-reading materials, so they kind of knew what this was about and said, yes, that's what we want to use the retreat. Both speakers couldn't make it, like had to cancel, which left me with, you know, a day on the calendar for the retreat that had been on the books for a year. Like, you cannot move the retreat. You can't move anything on my board's calendar. So here we were going to be, and I'm talking to my board chair, like, what are we going to do? I have no speakers. They've read the content. And so we just pulled together kind of a loosey-goosey agenda for the day. And at the end of the day, they were so happy. They were like, I had space to breathe. We got to kind of take left tours and right tours, and then but we still had kind of a framework for where we were heading in the day. And they said, we want to do this 3 times a year. And I'm like, wait, what? And so we now are planning, we'll keep our regular full day in March, but then 2 other times a year, we're doing half days in order to make space and time, because we've got our board meetings dialed so much around governance and business that has to happen with what we're managing. But the retreats give them a chance to just dig in deeper and ask questions and get to know each other better. And so I'm excited about that, because for me, those 2, what used to be board meeting times will be half-day retreats, are a lot less work for me. I don't have to do these, 80-page packets and all this stuff. And I can certainly bring an education focus and just space and time, create the space and time for them to really get engaged. So it's a constant negotiation is, I guess, the answer there.
Great. Thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anybody have anything right now going on in their board that you just want to candidly, cone of silence, share that you just would love some advice on? It can be like the talk radio call-in show now.
I do have a quick question about possible conflicts of interest, or maybe that's not the right way to frame it, but obviously as a board member, a key role that we play is to connect